Daniel Mercer was 36 years old and owned half of Houston. He noticed everything, every figure, every contract, every discrepancy, except the woman who had raised him. Her name was Dorothy. Dorothy Jean Wallace. She had been with his family since he was 2 years old, a quiet constant in a life full of noise and movement. When his mother passed from cancer, Dorothy held him through the nightmares. When his father collapsed under the weight of grief and whiskey, Dorothy kept the household standing. She cooked the meals, pressed the shirts, and loved a broken little boy when no one else had the strength to. She was steady, warm, and completely devoted. And Daniel never once asked about her life. He never wondered where she went after her shifts ended. Never asked if she was lonely, or hurting, or tired. He never thought to learn what she dreamed about or what kept her going. To Daniel, Dorothy was simply there, quiet, faithful, invisible, the way furniture is invisible, the way walls are invisible. You only notice them when something goes wrong. Something appeared to go wrong 3 weeks ago. Daniel first noticed it on a Tuesday. Dorothy left his downtown Houston high-rise at 8:30 in the evening, carrying 2 large canvas bags that were clearly heavy. He knew she hadn't arrived with those bags that morning. He'd been standing at the lobby window when she walked in at 7 a.m., carrying only her small brown purse. But when she walked out that night, those 2 bags were stuffed full, straining at the seams, weighing her shoulders down. He told himself it was nothing. Then it happened Thursday. Then the following Monday. Same bags, same time, same quiet exit. Every time he spotted her from across the lobby or through the elevator glass, his jaw tightened. His mind, trained by years of business to detect patterns and irregularities, went to a dark place immediately. She's taking something. Daniel ran a quiet inventory. He checked his study, his pantry, the supply closet, the safe behind the painting in his master bedroom. Nothing was missing. Not a single item out of place. His business records were untouched. His valuables were accounted for. Yet those bags kept appearing, night after night, stuffed full of something she clearly didn't want him to see. The question burned in him like acid. What was Dorothy hiding? So on a rainy Wednesday evening, Daniel decided he would find out for himself. He left his office on the 68th floor early, told his assistant he had a private appointment, and drove his black SUV to the far end of the parking structure across from his building. He cut the engine, pulled up his collar, and waited in the dark like a man convinced he was about to catch something terrible. Dorothy walked out at 8:15. Coat pulled tight against the October rain. The 2 bags hanging heavy from both hands, her steps slow but deliberate. Daniel's chest constricted watching her. He waited until she reached the corner, then pulled out into traffic 2 car lengths behind. She took the city bus south. Deep into neighborhoods that Daniel's development company had quietly been reshaping for the last decade. Streets he knew from spreadsheets and satellite images and zoning reports. He followed in his SUV, staying a safe distance back, watching the bus stop and go, carrying her deeper into the south side of the city. She got off at Wheeler Avenue, turned down a side street, and disappeared around the back of an old brick church. Paint peeling off the front steps. A faded wooden sign barely readable in the rain. Cornerstone Community Fellowship. All are welcome. Daniel parked, pulled his hood low, and followed her on foot. He found a rusted metal door at the back of the building propped open with a cinder block. Warm light spilled from below. The sound of voices drifted up. He crept down the concrete stairs slowly. The basement stopped him cold. It was full of people. Dozens of them. Homeless men in worn coats. Exhausted mothers cradling small children. Teenagers with nowhere else to go. Elderly men eating quietly from paper plates. And there was Dorothy, her silver hair unpinned and falling loose around her shoulders, wearing an old green sweater and jeans, standing at a wide stove in the corner, stirring a massive pot, calling people by name, smiling wider than Daniel had ever seen in 34 years. A young man stepped up to the serving table. "Miss Dorothy, please tell me you made cornbread tonight." "Made it fresh this afternoon, baby. 2 pieces for you." She wrapped them in foil and handed them over like she was passing him something sacred. A small girl tugged at Dorothy's sleeve. "Where does all the food come from, Miss Dorothy?" Dorothy bent down, eye level with the child. "I make it with love, sweetheart, so you grow up big and strong." Daniel couldn't breathe. Those bags were never stolen goods. They were groceries. Home-cooked food. Meals she prepared with her own hands, bought with her own modest paycheck, carried on her own tired shoulders every week to feed people who had nothing. People that Daniel's company, his developments, his rent increases, his buyouts, had in many cases pushed out of their homes and into these very streets. She could have asked him for help. She had full access to him, 34 years of proximity, enough trust to have said something. But she hadn't. Because after all those years, Dorothy had made a quiet decision about the man she worked for. She didn't trust him with her mercy. She didn't believe he would understand it. She was protecting something pure from someone she'd decided wasn't ready to receive it. Daniel stumbled backward up the stairs. The cold rain hit his face like a verdict. He walked to his SUV and sat there in the dark for a long time, hands on the wheel, unable to move. Watching the church. Watching the light in the basement window. Listening to the rain. He had followed her expecting to find a thief. Instead, he found a saint. Daniel sat in his SUV for 2 full hours. The rain never stopped. It drummed against the roof of the vehicle in steady waves, and he let it, staring at that basement window, watching shadows move behind the glass. People eating. People talking. Dorothy moving among them like she belonged to something ancient and holy that he had never been invited into. When she finally emerged, the bags were empty, folded flat under her arm. Her steps were slower now, the weight of the evening settling into her bones. She pulled her coat tighter and looked up at the sky the way people do when they've accepted the rain as simply part of the journey. Daniel rolled down his window. "Dorothy." She turned. No surprise crossed her face. No panic, no guilt, no scrambling for an explanation. Just quiet sadness, the kind that has lived in a person so long it no longer needs to announce itself. "Get in," he said. She did. They drove in silence through the wet Houston streets. The wipers moved back and forth in a slow, steady rhythm. Neither of them spoke for several minutes. Daniel kept his eyes on the road because he didn't trust himself to look at her. He didn't know what his face would do. Then his voice cracked open like old wood. "How long?" Dorothy stared out the passenger window at the passing streetlights. 17 years, she said quietly. "Since my daughter passed." Daniel's hands tightened on the wheel. He remembered that funeral. He had sent flowers. White lilies in a tall arrangement with a card signed with sympathy, the Mercer family. He had not attended. He had a conference call that afternoon, something about a waterfront acquisition, and he had told himself Dorothy would understand. He had never asked how her daughter died. Never followed up. Never once checked on her in the weeks that followed. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked. "About the shelter. About what you were doing." Dorothy turned from the window and looked at him directly. "What would you have done, Daniel?" He opened his mouth. "Made it about yourself?" Her voice was soft but carried the sharpness of a woman who had thought about this for a very long time. "Written a check and put your name on the door? Turned those people into your charity case?" She shook her head gently. "I wanted them to stay human. Not a tax deduction. Not a press release. Just people." Something cracked inside Daniel's chest. Not the clean break of glass but the slow, grinding fracture of something that had been weakening for years. He drove her south, through neighborhoods his company's reports described as emerging markets and high potential corridors. In the dark, they just looked like streets where people lived. Where porch lights were on. Where somebody's grandmother was probably still awake watching television. Dorothy directed him to a small brick house on Alameda Road. A modest place with a tidy front porch and a rosebush that had gone dormant for winter. He walked her to the door without being asked to. He didn't know why. It felt like the least he could do, which, he was beginning to realize, was exactly the problem. He had always done the least. Inside, through the open doorway, he caught a glimpse of her living room before she could close the door fully. And that was when he saw it. Hanging on the wall in a simple wooden frame, slightly off-center, like it had been placed there by someone who didn't think much about decorating but thought everything about what it represented. A military medal. Bronze. A ribbon of red, white, and blue. Below it, a small typed card that read, Bronze Star Medal. Awarded to Sergeant Dorothy Jean Wallace. Operation Desert Storm. For conspicuous acts of valor in the face of enemy fire, resulting in the preservation of 17 American lives. Daniel stood frozen in the doorway. The woman who ironed his dress shirts every Monday morning. The woman who remembered how he liked his coffee without being told. The woman who had quietly, faithfully, invisibly moved through his life for 34 years. She was a decorated combat veteran. A war hero. She had run toward gunfire to pull soldiers out of danger. She had saved 17 lives under conditions that most people cannot even imagine, and then she had come home to a country that gave her nothing, found her way into his family's employment, and spent the next 3 decades making sure Daniel Mercer never had to worry about whether his breakfast was warm. And he had never known. He had never asked. Dorothy gently closed the door. Not unkindly. Just finally. Daniel stood on her porch in the October rain for a long moment. Then he walked back to his SUV, sat down, and could not bring himself to start the engine. He sat there until nearly 4 in the morning. Until the rain finally stopped and the street went completely still and the first gray light of dawn began to push at the edge of the sky. He thought about being 7 years old at his mother's funeral in a suit that was too tight around the collar. His father standing 10 feet away, unreachable, dissolved in his own grief. And Dorothy appearing at Daniel's side without a word, taking his small hand in hers, and holding it through the entire service. Letting him cry into her coat afterward in the church parking lot while his father stared at the ground. He thought about being 12, struggling with algebra at the kitchen table in an empty house, and Dorothy sitting across from him, not understanding a single equation, but staying anyway. Making hot chocolate. Telling him he was smarter than he believed. He thought about being 17, the night before he left for Rice University, when she hugged him in the front hallway and whispered, "Make me proud." He had built a billion-dollar company. Put the Mercer name on half of Houston. But sitting outside her small house on Alameda Road, he understood something devastating. He had never once circled back to ask if she was proud. Had never asked what she needed. Had never asked if she was okay. He pulled out his phone and opened the notes application. Then he typed the first honest question he had formed in 34 years. Who is Dorothy Jean Wallace? He stared at it for a long time. Then he drove home as the sun came up over the Houston skyline, feeling like the poorest man alive. Daniel could not focus. He sat at his desk on the 68th floor of the Mercer Tower, staring at a contract worth $52 million. The numbers blurred together into meaningless shapes. His coffee went cold. His assistant knocked twice before he acknowledged her. Mr. Mercer, the development partners from Dallas are holding on line 2. You scheduled this call a month ago. Tell them I'll call back. She blinked. Sir, these are the Riverside Plaza investors. They flew in specifically for. I said I'll call back, Sandra. She left without another word. Daniel leaned back in his chair and pressed the heels of his palms against his eyes. 17 lives. Dorothy had saved 17 lives in a war zone, under fire, with bullets cutting the air around her, and he hadn't known she'd served a single day in uniform. He had shared a home with this woman for the better part of his entire life and known almost nothing real about her. He opened his laptop and typed her name into the search bar. Dorothy Jean Wallace. Desert Storm. Bronze Star. A few sparse military record databases came up. A digitized list of Bronze Star recipients from 1991. Her name was there, plain and unadorned. Sergeant Dorothy J. Wallace. No article. No profile. No photograph. No story attached to her sacrifice. The world had moved on and left her completely behind, the same way he had. Daniel closed the laptop, grabbed his coat, and told Sandra he was leaving. "It's not even noon, Mr. Mercer. I'm aware of what time it is." He drove south. Back to Wheeler Avenue. Back to the neighborhood he had only ever seen through the lens of development potential and profit projection. In the daylight, it looked entirely different from the way it appeared in his property reports. Front porches with people sitting on them in the mid-morning sun. Children riding bicycles on the sidewalk. A man in coveralls repairing a chain-link fence with patient, careful hands. A woman watering plants in a window box on the second floor of an old apartment building. People lived here. Real, full, complicated people with histories and routines and neighbors they waved to every morning. Not obstacles. Not statistics. Not line items in a displacement analysis. Daniel parked near the church and sat for a moment, looking at it in daylight. Cornerstone Community Fellowship. The paint on the front steps was even more visibly weathered than it had appeared in the rain the night before. One of the wooden window frames had cracked and been repaired with a strip of silver duct tape. The sign out front had a missing letter in the word community, so it read Community Hope. Someone had written the missing letter back in with black marker. He walked around to the back and down the concrete steps. The metal door was unlocked. Inside, the basement was quiet and empty. Folding tables stacked neatly against the far wall. A row of mismatched plastic chairs. A handwritten banner taped above the serving counter that read "You are seen. You are welcome. You matter." The faint smell of last night's soup still lingered in the warm air. Daniel stood in the middle of the room and tried to picture Dorothy here. Stirring pots. Wrapping cornbread in foil. Kneeling down to talk to a child. Calling grown men by name with a warmth that made them feel remembered. "Can I help you?" Daniel turned. A young man stood in the doorway leading to the back stairwell. Military bearing, even in civilian clothes. Broad shoulders. Watchful eyes. The same person Daniel had briefly noticed the previous night near the serving table. "I was just looking around," Daniel said. The young man studied him carefully. "You were here last night. Standing at the top of the stairs like you couldn't decide whether to come in or run." A pause. "You're the developer, aren't you? Mercer Development. You own a good portion of the buildings in this zip code." "I do." The young man crossed his arms. "So what are you doing here?" Daniel searched for the right words and came up empty. "I'm trying to understand something." "Understand what exactly?" "Dorothy. The woman who runs this place." Something shifted in the young man's expression. Not warmth exactly, but a slight lowering of the guard. "Miss Dorothy doesn't run it. She just shows up. Every single week, without fail, for years. She cooks, she serves, she sits with people. She remembers everybody's name and everybody's story." He walked slowly toward the kitchen area, ran his hand along the counter the way a person touches something they consider sacred. "I'm Raymond, by the way." "Daniel Mercer." Raymond nodded like he'd already known that. "I came back from 2 tours in Afghanistan about 4 years ago. Couldn't hold a job. Couldn't sleep. Kept having episodes in public places, grocery stores, parking lots. Loud noises, crowds. I was living on the streets for about 8 months. He looked at the stove. Miss Dorothy found me sleeping against the back wall of this church one night in January. Didn't call anyone. Didn't ask questions. Just sat down on the ground next to me and offered me a cup of soup from a thermos she was carrying. Daniel felt something shift behind his ribs. She came back the next week, Raymond continued. And the week after that. Eventually she helped me get into a veterans program over on Fannin Street. Got me into transitional housing. Checked on me every single week for 2 years straight. He looked at Daniel steadily. She saved my life. Not because she had to. Not because anyone was watching. Just because she decided I mattered. The basement was very quiet. She saved 17 soldiers in Desert Storm, Daniel said softly. She was a combat medic. Got the Bronze Star. Raymond stared at him. She never told me that. She never tells anyone. They stood in silence for a moment, 2 men held still by the same realization about the same woman. Why are you really here, Mr. Mercer? Raymond asked. Daniel looked around the basement. At the handwritten banner. At the mismatched chairs. At the small stove where Dorothy had stood the night before serving people his company had priced out of their homes. Because I've known her my entire life, he said, his voice dropping. And I just realized I don't know her at all. Raymond watched him for a long moment. She works for you. The family she's spent decades with. Yes. And you never asked. No. Raymond exhaled slowly, shook his head. Man. She pours everything she has into people like us. And the person she actually goes home to work for every day, the one with the resources to actually make a difference, never even bothered to see her. He moved toward the door, then stopped. She comes every Thursday. 7 o'clock. You want to understand her. Don't just visit once. Show up. Stay. Keep your mouth closed and your ears open. He walked out. Daniel stood alone in the basement. The smell of soup. The quiet. The banner that said you are seen. And for the first time in his entire adult life, Daniel Mercer felt genuinely, profoundly small. Not because of what he lacked in wealth or status or power. But because of everything he had never given. Everything he had walked past every single day without once stopping to notice. He pulled out his phone and opened his calendar. Thursday night was blocked with a gala at the Marriott Marquis. Investors, donors, catered dinner, speeches about urban revitalization and corporate social responsibility. His name on the program in bold letters. Daniel deleted it without hesitating. Then he typed in its place, Cornerstone Community Fellowship. 7 p.m. He didn't know exactly what was coming. But he knew, with a certainty that felt new and solid in his chest, that he could not walk away from this. Not this time. Not again. Thursday arrived gray and cool, the way Houston sometimes gets in late October when the Gulf breeze finally remembers it has somewhere to be. Daniel left his office at 6:15. His business partner called twice during the drive south. He watched the phone light up on the passenger seat and let it ring both times. He parked near the church at 6:50 and sat for a few minutes watching people arrive. Men in worn jackets walking slowly. A woman holding a toddler on her hip with one arm and gripping an older child's hand with the other. An elderly man making careful progress down the sidewalk with an aluminum walking cane. Each of them moving toward the basement door with the quiet purposefulness of people who knew exactly where the warmth was. Daniel got out of the car. He walked down the concrete steps and pushed open the metal door. Dorothy was already there, moving between the folding tables with practiced efficiency, arranging paper bowls, setting out plastic spoons, positioning the napkin stacks at even intervals the way someone does when they have done something so many times that the details have become a form of prayer. She looked up when he entered. Neither of them spoke for a moment. The room hummed around them with the sounds of preparation. A pot bubbling on the stove. Chairs scraping against the concrete floor as people began to settle in. "Mr. Mercer," Dorothy said finally. Her voice was measured. "Careful." "I wanted to help," Daniel said. He kept his hands at his sides, his tone even, trying not to make it sound like a performance. "If that's all right with you." Dorothy studied his face for a long moment, the way she used to study his homework as a boy, looking not just at the answers but at whether he had actually thought about them. Then she nodded once, slowly. "Soup needs stirring. Pot's on the left burner." Daniel moved to the small kitchen, picked up the long wooden spoon, and stirred. It was a simple act. Humble. He had not stirred a pot of soup since he was perhaps 9 years old, standing on a step stool in the family kitchen while Dorothy guided his small hand around the rim. That memory surfaced now with unexpected force. People began filing in steadily. Raymond appeared, nodded at Daniel once without smiling, then moved to help with the chairs. An older gentleman with the aluminum cane made his way to a table near the wall and sat down with a long, careful exhale. A mother arranged her 2 children on either side of her and immediately began cutting food into smaller pieces for the younger one without looking down, the automatic grace of a parent. Dorothy moved through it all like she was the still center of a turning world. She touched shoulders. She asked quiet questions. She filled bowls with her attention as much as with her ladle. "You going to stand there all evening?" Raymond called from across the room. Daniel looked at Dorothy. She was already holding out a stack of paper bowls without looking at him, her attention on a family that had just come through the door. "People are waiting," she said simply. He took the bowls and began serving. It felt awkward at first. He was a man accustomed to being served, to sitting at the head of tables, to having assistants manage the logistics of every room he entered. Standing behind a folding table ladling soup into paper bowls for strangers required a different kind of posture, not just physical but interior. He had to figure out where to put his eyes. How to speak. Whether to speak at all. An older woman came through the line. White hair pinned up neatly despite everything. She held out her bowl with both hands and when Daniel filled it she looked directly at him and said, "Thank you, baby," with a sincerity so complete it nearly undid him. "You're welcome," he said. She smiled and moved on. He kept serving. One bowl, then another. A teenage boy who wouldn't make eye contact. A middle-aged man who said nothing but nodded deeply, as if a nod could carry the full weight of gratitude. A young woman holding an infant who couldn't have been more than 3 months old. Halfway through the evening Daniel noticed Dorothy swaying slightly near the stove. It was subtle, just a brief loss of equilibrium, quickly corrected. She gripped the counter's edge and steadied herself, then straightened and continued serving as if nothing had happened. "Dorothy." Daniel set down his ladle and moved toward her. "I'm perfectly fine," she said, not looking up. "When did you last eat something?" She didn't answer. He looked at the pot, then at her, then at the pot again. She had spent all afternoon cooking enough food to feed 60 people and had set nothing aside for herself. "Sit down," he said quietly. "There are still people coming through though." "Sit down, Dorothy." Something in his voice, not commanding but genuinely concerned, made her pause. She looked at him with an expression he couldn't fully read. Then she moved to a chair near the wall and lowered herself into it slowly. Daniel filled a bowl, brought it to her, and set it down in front of her without ceremony. "Eat." Dorothy looked up at him. And in that moment, for the first time in all the years he had known her, Daniel saw something in her face that she had never allowed him to see before. Vulnerability. Pure and unguarded. The look of someone who has been strong for so long that being cared for feels almost foreign. She picked up her spoon and ate. Daniel returned to the serving line. Raymond watched him from across the room with an expression that had shifted slightly from the previous suspicion. It wasn't trust yet. But it was the beginning of something adjacent to it. An hour later the crowd began to thin. People thanked Dorothy on their way out, hugged her, pressed her hands between theirs, told her they would see her next week. Several of them looked at Daniel with cautious curiosity but said nothing. When the last person left, Daniel helped clean up without being asked. He stacked chairs, gathered the paper bowls, wiped down the folding tables with a damp cloth he found hanging on a nail by the sink. Dorothy moved slowly beside him, quieter than usual, her shoulders lower than when the evening began. When everything was done she pulled on her coat and picked up her empty bags. "I'll drive you home," Daniel said. "You don't need to do that." "I know I don't need to. I want to." She considered him for a moment. Then she nodded. They walked to his SUV through the cool night air. She got in. He drove. The city slid past the windows in amber and shadow. "Why did you come tonight?" Dorothy asked after several minutes of silence. Daniel kept his eyes on the road. "Raymond told me if I really wanted to understand, I had to show up and keep showing up. Not just visit once." "And do you understand?" He thought about the older woman who called him baby. About the teenage boy who wouldn't make eye contact. About Dorothy swaying at the stove after feeding 60 people without eating herself. "I'm starting to," he said honestly. They pulled up to her house on Alameda Road. Daniel turned off the engine. "You should have told me you weren't feeling well," he said. "I'm fine. You almost fell over at the stove." Dorothy looked out at her front porch. "I've been tired before. I'll recover." "When did you last see a doctor?" Long silence. "Dorothy." 3 years, she said quietly. "Maybe closer to 4. Daniel's chest tightened. "Why?" She turned to look at him then, and her eyes were patient and clear and devastating all at once. "Because doctors cost money, Mr. Mercer. And I had other priorities." She got out of the car, walked to her door, and let herself in. The porch light clicked on automatically. Daniel sat in the dark outside her house with his hands on the wheel, watching her window light up from the inside. He pulled out his phone and called his head of human resources. It was 9:47 in the evening. "Sir." His HR director answered, surprised. "I need Dorothy Wallace's insurance plan upgraded immediately. Full comprehensive coverage. No deductibles, no coverage gaps, no limits. Effective as of today. Mr. Mercer, it's nearly 10 at night, I understand what time it is. Get it done first thing tomorrow morning and confirm it to me in writing." He hung up. Sat there a while longer. The street was quiet. A dog barked somewhere 2 blocks over and then went silent. He had given Dorothy the cheapest insurance package his company offered. He had paid her a salary he told himself was fair without ever asking what fair actually meant for her life. He had never considered what her monthly expenses looked like, what she could and could not afford, what she was quietly going without so that other people could have enough. She had given him 34 years. And he had given her scraps dressed up as generosity. That was going to change. All of it. Starting now. Daniel did not sleep that night either. He sat at the wide mahogany desk in his home study with his laptop open and files spreading across every available surface. Documents his assistant had compiled at his request. Property acquisition records. Displacement reports. Buyout figures. Relocation data stretching back across 10 years of Mercer development projects. 41 buildings acquired. 1,940 families relocated. He had asked for the numbers before without really reading them. Tonight he read every single line. James Patterson. Age 64. Lived in his apartment 26 years. Worked as a maintenance supervisor at the elementary school 3 blocks from his building. Buyout received from Mercer Development, $15,000. Current status, relocated to Pasadena, 40 minutes outside the city. Lost his job due to commute distance. No longer able to see his grandchildren on weekday evenings. Daniel sat back. Kept reading. Maria Santos. Single mother. 3 children ages 4, 7, and 11. Employed as a home health aide during the day and an office cleaner 3 nights per week. Displacement from her midtown apartment forced her to move her family to a smaller unit in Missouri City. Her children changed schools mid-semester. She now spends 4.5 hours daily on public transportation simply getting to and from her 2 jobs. Daniel's hands were trembling slightly. He kept going. A young couple, newlyweds, who had saved for 4 years to afford their first apartment together, gone in 60 days with a buyout that covered 2 months of rent at comparable Houston rates. An elderly Vietnamese woman who had lived in the same unit since 1974, who had raised 3 children and buried a husband within those walls, who died 14 months after being displaced. Her daughter submitted a formal complaint to the City Housing Board. The letter stated plainly that her mother never recovered from losing her home. That the displacement had broken something fundamental in her that medical care could not reach. Daniel read that letter 4 times. Then he closed his laptop, put his head down on the desk, and wept in a way he had not wept since he was a boy in Dorothy's arms at his mother's funeral. He was still at his desk when the sun came up. His phone buzzed at 7:15. A text from his business partner, Renee. Board meeting at 9. You ready? Daniel stared at the message for a long moment. At the files covering his desk. At the names he had spent all night finally learning. He was not ready. He suspected he never would be completely ready. But he was going to walk into that room anyway. He showered, dressed in a charcoal suit, and drove to Mercer Tower. The boardroom on the 55th floor was full when he arrived. 8 people around the long glass table. Renee at the far end with her reading glasses on, reviewing something on her tablet. The CFO, David Chu, sorting through printed financial summaries. 6 others who had helped Daniel build everything the Mercer name stood for in this city. Daniel stood at the head of the table and did not sit down. I'm restructuring how we develop, he said. No preamble. No pleasantries. No slide presentation. David Chu looked up immediately. Andrew, we've already discussed the Riverside. I spent last night reading displacement records, Daniel said. 1,940 families over 10 years. People who lost their homes because we determined their neighborhoods had financial potential. His voice was controlled but raw at the edges. We have been calling it urban development. It isn't. It's extraction. We move into communities that cannot afford to resist us, we take what we want, we build things the original residents can never afford to return to, and we call it progress. The room went very still. I met a man this week, Daniel continued. Calvin Wilson. 73 years old. We acquired his building on Alameda 2 years ago, renovated it, and tripled the rent within 60 days. The buyout we offered him was $12,000 for 40 years of his life in that apartment. That money lasted him 6 months. He now sleeps in a shelter or at a community center on Wheeler Avenue. Daniel paused. I served him soup last Thursday. Renee set down her tablet slowly. Daniel, his CFO said carefully. These are unfortunate outcomes, but displacement is an unavoidable component of. It is not unavoidable, Daniel said, his voice rising for the first time. We chose it. The projections we approved showed that 63% of displaced residents would be permanently priced out of the surrounding area. We saw that number. We initialed it. We moved forward because the margin was favorable. He looked around the table. We knew what we were doing to people and we did it anyway. The room erupted. Multiple voices talking simultaneously. Concerns about investor commitments, project timelines, fiduciary obligations, market positioning. Daniel let it run for 90 seconds. Then he raised one hand. Silence. I am proposing we build differently going forward. Mixed income housing structures. Community land trust models for long-term residents. Local hiring requirements written into every contract. Profit-sharing arrangements with established neighborhood stakeholders. He looked at David. Our margins will compress. I expect between 30 and 40%. The institutional investors will withdraw, David said flatly. Then we find investors aligned with a different model. Renee spoke for the first time. Daniel, what has happened to you? Her voice was not unkind. Genuinely curious. I woke up, he said simply. To what? To the fact that I have spent a decade building monuments to myself on top of other people's lives. And I cannot do it anymore. He looked at each person around the table in turn. I am moving forward with this restructuring. I would prefer to do it with your support. But I will do it either way. Long silence settled over the room. Then Margaret Okafor spoke. She was the oldest member of the board, had been with the company since Daniel's father ran it from a single office on Main Street. She had silver locks and the steady gaze of someone who had seen many things come and go. Your father built this company on relationships, Margaret said. On knowing the people he built for. On understanding that a building is only as valuable as the community it serves. She folded her hands on the table. Somewhere along the way we forgot that. Perhaps it's time we remembered. Another board member nodded. Then another. 2 members gathered their materials and walked out of the room without speaking. 5 remained. Renee looked at Daniel for a long moment. You're absolutely certain. I have never been more certain of anything in my life. She exhaled. Then let's figure out how to make it work financially without destroying everything we've built in the process. The meeting ran 4.5 hours. Budgets were recalculated. Timelines were extended. A new community investment framework was drafted in broad strokes that would need weeks of detailed work to fully develop. When it ended, Daniel drove directly to Dorothy's house on Alameda Road. She answered the door in a robe, looking more rested than she had in the hospital but still moving carefully, conserving her energy the way people do when their body has issued a warning they have finally decided to respect. Mr. Mercer. Is everything all right? I came from a board meeting, he said. We're changing the entire development model. How we acquire. How we build. Who we build for. Everything. Dorothy studied his face the way she always had, looking past the surface of things. And I need your help with it, Daniel continued. Not as my employee. As my partner. Community Relations Director. Full executive salary. Full benefits package. A seat at every table where decisions get made about the communities we've been affecting. Dorothy was quiet for a long moment. Why me? She asked. Because you have been seeing people that I have spent my whole career ignoring. Because you have been doing this work for 17 years with your own money and your own strength while I built towers. Daniel's voice tightened. And because you are the only person who loved me enough to keep serving others even when I gave you no reason to believe I would ever understand why. Dorothy's eyes filled slowly with tears. You showed me what grace looks like, Daniel said. Now I am asking you to help me build something worthy of it. Dorothy reached out and touched his face with one thin, worn hand. The same hand that had wiped his tears when he was 7. The same hand that had packed his bags for college. The same hand that had, for 17 years, carried soup to strangers in the dark. Okay, she whispered. Daniel felt something release in his chest. Not guilt this time. Something cleaner. Purpose. The specific, grounded weight of a man who has finally found the right direction to walk. It won't be easy, Dorothy said, dropping her hand. People won't trust you. Not right away. Trust is built in years, not board meetings. I know. Then let's begin, she said. And for the first time in 34 years, she did not call him Mr. Mercer. She called him Daniel. 3 months passed. Houston moved through winter and into the tentative warmth of early spring. Mercer Development moved with it, slowly, painfully, the way any large thing moves when it changes direction. New frameworks were drafted and redrafted. Legal teams worked overtime restructuring acquisition agreements. 3 institutional investors withdrew their capital as predicted. 2 new ones, a community development financial institution out of Atlanta and a faith-based impact investment fund based in Denver, came in to partially replace them. Daniel showed up at Cornerstone Community Fellowship every Thursday at 7 o'clock without exception. He missed one evening in February for a medical emergency involving his father and called Raymond that same night to apologize. Raymond told him that was the most normal thing he had done yet. He was getting better at it. Serving. Listening. Remembering names. He was not as natural at it as Dorothy, who seemed to carry people's stories in her bones, but he was learning that showing up consistently was itself a form of love that most people in his position never bothered to offer. Dorothy had begun her role as community relations director, working 3 days a week from home while she continued her recovery. Her medications were stabilizing her blood pressure and managing her diabetes with encouraging results. Dr. Patel had expressed cautious optimism at her last follow-up appointment. Dorothy had expressed characteristic impatience with the word cautious. It was on a Thursday in early March that everything shifted again. Calvin Wilson came through the serving line at 7:40. Daniel recognized him immediately from the displacement files he had memorized over those long sleepless nights. 73 years old. Aluminum cane. Gray beard trimmed close to his face. He moved with the deliberate dignity of a man who has decided that whatever the world has taken from him, it will not take his bearing. Daniel filled his bowl. "Evening," Daniel said. Calvin Wilson nodded once, took his soup, and moved to his usual corner table. Sat down slowly with a long exhale that seemed to carry the weight of the entire day inside it. Daniel finished serving the remainder of the line. Then he walked across the room, stopped at Calvin Wilson's table, and asked the only question that felt honest. "May I sit with you?" Calvin Wilson looked up. Studied Daniel's face with the unhurried assessment of someone who has learned through hard experience that most people asking to sit with you want something from you. "Free country," he said. Daniel sat. His throat felt tight. He knew exactly who this man was. Had known since the night he read through the displacement files until sunrise. But knowing someone's file and sitting across from them in a church basement while they eat soup from a paper bowl are 2 entirely different experiences. "I'm Daniel Mercer," he said. Calvin Wilson's expression did not change. He took another slow spoonful of soup. "I know who you are." The words were not angry. They were simply tired. The exhaustion of a man who has seen too many things to waste energy on outrage. "You bought my building," Calvin Wilson said, his eyes steady on the middle distance. 3 years ago now. Said you were going to improve it. Modernize it. And you did. Put in new plumbing, new windows, fresh paint throughout. It looked real fine when you were done. Daniel sat completely still. Then you raised the rent from $750 a month to $2,200. Calvin Wilson set his spoon down carefully. Gave everyone 60 days to sign a new lease or vacate the premises. I'd been in that apartment 39 years. Moved in when my wife Patricia was pregnant with our son Marcus Jr. Raised that boy in those rooms. Patricia passed in that apartment in 2009. I sat beside her bed and held her hand and watched her go. He paused. Every morning for 39 years I sat in my chair by the east window and watched the sun come up over the rooftops. It was the first thing I did every single day. Before coffee. Before anything. Daniel felt tears building behind his eyes and refused to let them fall because this moment did not belong to his feelings. It belonged to Calvin Wilson. The buyout your company gave me was $11,000, Calvin continued. For 39 years. $11,000. He picked up his spoon again. That money ran out in 5 months. I've been in a shelter on Dowling Street most nights since then. Some nights I come here and Raymond lets me sleep on a cot in the back room when the shelter is full. The basement had grown quieter around them. Not silent, but quieter. Several people nearby were listening without pretending not to. "I'm sorry," Daniel said. His voice came out smaller than he intended. Calvin Wilson looked at him directly for the first time. "Are you sorry? Or do you just feel bad now that you've got a face and a name attached to the paperwork you signed without reading?" The question was precise and merciless and completely fair. "Both," Daniel said honestly. "I feel bad because I should. And I'm sorry because what I did was wrong and I knew enough to have known better if I had simply bothered to look." Calvin Wilson was quiet for a moment, turning his spoon slowly in his bowl. "You know what the worst part of it was," he said finally. "It wasn't personal to you. That's what I had to make my peace with. I wasn't a person to you. I was a unit in an occupied building in a desirable corridor. You probably signed that acquisition and that rent restructuring in the same afternoon without giving either one a second thought." "You're right," Daniel said. "I did. I had a home," Calvin Wilson said. His voice did not rise but something behind it intensified, a contained heat, the kind that has been burning low and steady for a very long time. "I had a place where I belonged. Where my neighbors knew my name and knocked on my door if they hadn't seen me in a couple days. Where I watched my son take his first steps and learned to ride a bicycle in the parking lot. I had a life in that building. And your company looked at that life and decided it was worth $11,000 in 60 days. The words fell across the table between them like stones into still water. Around them the room had gone almost completely quiet. Raymond stood near the kitchen doorway watching. Dorothy sat at a side table, not intervening, letting this happen the way it needed to happen. "You can't give it back," Calvin Wilson said. "Can't give me back 39 years. Can't give me back Patricia's last years in a place she loved. Can't give me back the window and the sunrise." He looked at Daniel with clear, exhausted eyes. "So what exactly are you proposing to do?" Daniel leaned forward. His voice was steady but stripped of everything performative. "I can't undo it. I know that. But I am restructuring every future project this company undertakes, beginning with the Riverside Commons development on the south side. Mixed income housing. Community ownership stakes for long-term residents. First right of return for every family we have displaced." He paused. "And I need people who actually understand what these communities need to help design it. Not consultants from downtown offices. People who lived it." He looked at Calvin Wilson directly. "I want you to come work with us. Community Advisory Director. Real salary, real authority, real seat at the table where decisions get made. You tell us what we keep getting wrong. You help us understand what building for a community actually means instead of just building on top of one." The basement was completely silent now. Raymond stepped forward from the kitchen doorway. "You serious right now?" "Completely serious. You're going to let a man you made homeless tell you how to run a billion-dollar development company?" "He's not homeless," Daniel said, and his voice was firm and clear. "I made him homeless. There's a difference. And yes. Because he knows more about what these neighborhoods actually need than every consultant and urban planner I have ever paid to advise me." Calvin Wilson looked at Daniel for a long, measuring moment. The kind of look that has nothing to do with what a person is saying and everything to do with whether they mean it. He picked up his cornbread. Took a slow bite. Chewed thoughtfully. "I'll think on it," he said. It was not a yes. Daniel had not expected a yes. Trust of the kind Calvin Wilson would need to extend did not come from a single honest conversation in a church basement. It came from months of showing up. From consistency. From actions that matched words over time. But it was not a no either. Daniel nodded, stood, and walked back to the kitchen. His hands were shaking slightly. Raymond fell into step beside him. "That took something real," Raymond said quietly. "It was just the truth." "Yeah, but most people in your position dress the truth up until it doesn't look like itself anymore." Raymond picked up a dish towel and began drying bowls. "You just said it plain. I'm done dressing things up." Raymond nodded slowly. They finished cleaning in comfortable silence, the kind that begins to form between people who are still figuring out whether to trust each other but have decided the attempt is worth making. When the evening ended and the last person had gone, Daniel sat alone in the empty basement one more time. The smell of soup. The folded tables. The banner above the counter. "You are seen. You are welcome. You matter." He pulled out his phone and called his lead attorney. "The Riverside Commons project," he said. "I want every displaced family contacted personally by the end of next week. I want their full stories documented. Names, histories, how long they lived there, what they lost, what they need." He paused. "And I want a complete community benefit agreement drafted before we break ground. Not a formality. A real one with enforceable commitments. Daniel, that process alone will take 4 to 6 months minimum. Then we take 4 to 6 months." He hung up. Sat in the quiet. Made a promise to the empty room and to the people whose names he now knew and would not allow himself to forget. He would see them. Every single one. And he would build something worthy of being seen in return. Ground broke on Riverside Commons on a Thursday morning in late September. Daniel had specifically requested a Thursday. Dorothy understood why without being told. There were no politicians arranged in a row for photographs. No champagne. No podium draped in Mercer Development banners. No speeches about economic growth or urban revitalization or the exciting future of Houston's South Side. Just people. Families who were coming back. Children running through the dirt of the cleared lot shrieking with the specific joy of children who do not fully understand what is happening but feel instinctively that it is good. Elderly residents walking the property lines slowly, pointing at where things used to be, telling each other stories that the new buildings would eventually hold inside their walls like memory preserved in brick and mortar. Calvin Wilson stood at the eastern edge of the property with Daniel beside him. He was wearing a button-down shirt Daniel had never seen before. Navy blue. Pressed carefully. "My apartment was right there," Calvin said, pointing toward the center of the lot where the foundation markers had been laid. East-facing. Morning light came straight through the window around 6:30, 6:45 depending on the season. "We've already built the orientation into the new floor plan," Daniel said. Unit 4C. East-facing. Same approximate position. Same view of the rooftops and the water tower on Alameda. He paused. "It's yours if you want it. Not a rental. Deeded ownership. No mortgage. Mercer Development's contribution to what we took." Calvin Wilson was quiet for a very long time. He looked at the foundation markers. At the families moving around the property. At the sky above Houston, which was doing something genuinely beautiful that morning, layered with thin clouds that the early sun was turning gold from beneath. "Patricia would have liked that window," he said finally. "I believe she would have," Daniel said. Calvin Wilson nodded once. Firm and decided. Then yes. Across the lot, Maria Santos stood watching her 3 children chase each other around the perimeter of what would become the community garden. She had her arms folded and her chin tilted upward and the expression of a woman who has been through something genuinely difficult and come out the other side with her dignity not only intact but deepened. When she caught Daniel's eye she did not wave. She simply held his gaze for a moment and nodded, slowly, deliberately, the way people acknowledge something true that doesn't require words. Daniel nodded back. Raymond was near the east entrance with a group of 8 veterans, all of them enrolled in the jobs training program he had designed and now directed. They were going over construction safety orientation materials with the site foreman, a man named Gerald who had grown up 4 blocks from this very lot and whose father had worked in construction for 30 years. Raymond had specifically requested Gerald after finding him through the local hiring initiative Dorothy had helped establish in her first month as community relations director. Dorothy herself stood near the temporary site office, a converted shipping container painted pale yellow, talking with a group of women Daniel recognized from the Thursday evening shelter dinners. She was listening more than speaking, which was always how Daniel knew she was doing her most important work. Her silver hair caught the morning light. She looked stronger than she had in months. Dr. Patel had upgraded her prognosis from cautious optimism to genuine encouragement at her last appointment. Dorothy had told Daniel this with the same matter-of-fact tone she used to announce that his dry cleaning was ready. He walked over to her when the women moved on. "How are you feeling?" he asked. "Better than I have in years," she said. She looked out at the lot, at the families, at the activity and life filling a space that had been empty and contested for too long. "This is good work, Daniel. It's a beginning. It's more than a beginning. A beginning is just an idea. This is a commitment." She turned to look at him. "Do you understand the difference?" "I'm learning it." She smiled. The full one, the kind he had only ever seen in the basement of Cornerstone Community Fellowship until recently. It was becoming more frequent now, appearing in places he had never seen it before. In his office during planning meetings. In the community advisory sessions on Monday mornings. Occasionally, unexpectedly, in the elevator of Mercer Tower when she thought no one was watching. "I've been thinking about something," Daniel said. "You're always thinking about something. That night I followed you. 6 months ago." He looked at the ground for a moment, then back up. "I was completely certain I was about to catch you stealing from me. I had already decided what you were. Already written the story in my head." He shook his head slowly. "And the truth was the exact opposite of everything I assumed." Dorothy was quiet, listening. "You weren't taking anything from me," Daniel continued. "You had been giving me everything my entire life. Your time, your love, your grief, your strength. You held my whole childhood together with your bare hands and I walked through it like you were part of the furniture." His voice tightened. "And then you went home and gave whatever was left to people who had even less than I bothered to give you." Dorothy looked at him steadily. "I don't know if I will ever fully become the man you believed I could be," Daniel said. "But I am trying every single day. Because of you. Because you stayed when you had every reason to walk away. Because you forgave me before I even knew I needed forgiving." He paused. "And because you showed me that grace isn't something you receive when you deserve it. It's something someone gives you when you don't." Dorothy was quiet for a moment. Then she reached out and took his hand the way she used to take his small hand at his mother's funeral, firmly, without hesitation, as if holding on was simply the natural thing to do. "You know what's different about you now," she said. "What?" "You ask people their names before you ask them their situation. You used to walk into a room and immediately calculate what every person in it could do for you." She squeezed his hand gently. "Now you walk in and you look for who needs to be seen." Daniel felt the truth of it settle into him quietly. Shanice came running across the lot toward them, taller than she had been 6 months ago, her braids flying behind her. She grabbed Dorothy's free hand with both of hers and tugged. "Miss Dorothy, come see where our apartment is going to be. Mama says we're going to have a bedroom with a window that looks at a real tree." Dorothy laughed. The sound of it was uncomplicated and complete. "Lead the way, baby." Shanice pulled her forward across the lot. Dorothy went willingly, looking back at Daniel once over her shoulder with an expression he did not have words for but understood entirely. He watched them go. Calvin Wilson appeared beside him, moving carefully with his cane over the uneven ground. They stood together at the eastern edge of the property watching the morning unfold across the lot. Children running. Families talking. Raymond's veterans laughing at something the site foreman had said. Maria Santos kneeling down to show her youngest child something in the soil, probably a bug or a pebble or one of those small ordinary things that become extraordinary when seen through a child's eyes. "You know what I keep thinking about?" Calvin Wilson said. "What's that?" 39 years I watched the sun come up from that window. Every single morning. And I never once thought about what would happen if I lost it." He was quiet for a moment. "I guess I thought some things were just permanent. That if you'd had something long enough it belonged to you in a way that couldn't be undone." Daniel listened without speaking. "I was wrong about that," Calvin continued. "But I think maybe I was right about something else." He looked at Daniel. "Some things can be rebuilt. Not the same. Different. But maybe better in some ways because you know what it cost the first time." Daniel looked out at the lot. At the foundation markers. At the yellow shipping container office where Dorothy's name was already printed on a card beside the door. At Shanice pulling Dorothy toward the corner where her family's future apartment would stand. At Raymond's veterans, men who had come back from war to find their country had forgotten them, now holding clipboards and hard hats and purpose. "I spent 36 years building things I could see from 68 floors up," Daniel said. "Towers, skylines, my name on steel." He gestured slowly across the lot. "I couldn't see any of this from up there. You can only see it when you come down. When you get close enough to look people in the eye and stay long enough to learn their names." Calvin Wilson nodded. "And now you're down here." "I'm down here." They stood together in the morning light as the city moved around them, as Houston went about the ordinary business of being alive, as the first concrete was poured into the foundation of something that would last. Margaret Okafor arrived at 9:30 with two of the newer board members Daniel had brought in after the restructuring. She walked the property with him for 20 minutes, asking careful questions, listening to the answers, nodding in the way of someone who is genuinely measuring rather than performing interest. "Your grandfather would have approved," she said finally. "I think he would have gotten here faster than I did." "Perhaps. But you got here." She put her hand briefly on his arm. "That matters, Daniel. Don't spend so much time mourning the years you were blind that you failed to fully inhabit the years you can see." He carried those words with him for the rest of the morning. At noon Dorothy called everyone together near the center of the lot. No microphone, no podium, just her voice carrying across the cleared ground with the natural authority of someone people have learned to listen to. She spoke briefly about what this land had held before and what it would hold again. She spoke about the families returning and the families who could not return and the obligation that both groups placed on everyone involved to build something worthy of the sacrifice. Then she looked directly at Daniel. "This man followed me into a church basement 6 months ago expecting to find a thief," she said. Light laughter moved through the crowd. What he found instead was a room full of people he had never bothered to see. She held his gaze across the lot. "He has been learning to see ever since. And I want you all to know that learning to see, really see, is the hardest and most important work a person can do. It costs something. It changes you in ways you cannot predict or control." She paused. "But it makes you real. And real is the only thing worth being." The applause that followed was not the polished kind Daniel was accustomed to at galas and ribbon cuttings. It was something rawer and warmer and considerably more meaningful. That evening Daniel drove Dorothy home after the groundbreaking celebration wound down. They drove in comfortable silence through streets that Daniel now saw differently than he had 6 months ago. Not as coordinates on a development map. As neighborhoods. As the accumulated texture of people's daily lives. "Dorothy," she said. He corrected himself. He pulled up to her house on Alameda Road. The rosebush on the front porch had come back to life after the winter, small green shoots visible in the evening light. She had told him 2 weeks ago that it had been Patricia Wilson's rosebush originally, a cutting Calvin's late wife had given her years ago. He had not known that then. He knew it now. Dorothy gathered her things and opened the door. Then she stopped. Turned back. Daniel. Yes. She looked at him with everything she was, 34 years of quiet faithfulness, 17 years of feeding strangers, a Bronze Star, a daughter named Grace, a life so full it had never needed his acknowledgement to be complete. "Welcome home," she said. She got out and walked to her door. The porch light came on automatically. The rosebush rustled once in the evening breeze and went still. Daniel sat in the dark outside her small house on Alameda Road and felt the full weight and wonder of those two words settle into him like something that had always belonged there, waiting patiently for him to be ready to receive it. He had spent 36 years building towers. He had finally built something that mattered. Not a monument. Not an empire. Not a skyline bearing his name. A home. For people who deserved one. In a city that was learning, slowly and imperfectly and together, what it meant to see the ones it had forgotten. He looked up at the Houston sky, the same sky that covered his tower 68 floors above, and whispered the same simple prayer he had first learned to mean 6 months ago in a church basement on Wheeler Avenue. Thank you for Dorothy. For second chances. For eyes that finally see. The street was quiet. The rosebush was still. Somewhere nearby a child laughed at something in an upstairs window and the sound of it carried clean and clear through the evening air like proof that ordinary joy, the kind built on belonging and dignity and being known, was not only possible but already present, already happening, in the places we finally learn to look.